Hello again. Welcome back. We're going to talk about fallacies today. Um, and just maybe not everything there is to know about fallacies, but I think some important aspects of fallacies that, at least for intro classes and people studying philosophy for the first time, should know about, should think about. Fallacies are really interesting. If for no other reason than just the sort of wide, the wide area that fallacies cover, and and in part the difficulty we have in sort of pinning down what is and what isn't a fallacy. But I think for classes like this, the basic idea is pretty easy. So in a class like this, we're going to um, talk about a fallacy. As you know from your reading, we're going to talk about a fallacy as a kind of, as it says here, a kind of error in reasoning. And I'm going to go on, but this is an important point to make. A type of error in reasoning. Let's go over here to our whiteboard. Sorry. Um, and I want you to think about something as we do this. I've alluded to this before in class, but use a sort of Venn diagram here. And on one hand, we have. Um, let me redo that. We have this notion of belief, right? Let me make a bigger one here. We have this notion of belief. And these are the things we believe. The earth is round, 1 + 1 is equal to 2. My mom loves me, that sort of thing, or my parents love me, that sort of thing. Just any belief, something you believe. We talked about like a proposition to be true and so on. And what we've talked about before, also in class, is the intersection, if you will, between belief and reason. I'm actually going to put reasons. Presumably, there are reasons that justify your belief. You believe the earth is round because, I guess, I don't know if you can see my cursor. That's weird. I'll use this one. So we believe the earth is round because, um, you know, the evidence points in that direction. This scientist said this. This astronaut said this, and so on. And that's good, right? We want belief to be something. We want belief to be mitigated somehow by reasons. Um, it's obviously a little more detailed, more difficult than this, but we want beliefs to be mitigated somehow by reasons. We want reasons to sort of support, or I might say justify, our beliefs in things. Um, and then the point of a class like this, a philosophy class, whether it's ethics or logic or an introduction class, we want to talk about the intersection between belief, reasons, and argument. And that's where we have this intersection here. This is what we're after. We want to know about the relationship between the things we believe we hold to be true, right? And the reasons why we claim things to be true. But we want those reasons we want um, we want those reasons to be in a certain sort of structure, right? We want those reasons to be either in a deductive structure, an inductive structure, right? And you can watch some of the videos already. So I talk about those and some those distinctions in some of the other videos. So go back and watch that if you don't understand what these words mean. And again, keep in mind that this is very sort of general here. I just want you to get the idea about this. And we say, generally speaking, that if we have a belief that can't be justified in a certain way, either deductively or inductively, if we don't have reasons in a certain form to justify belief, then we say those beliefs are fallacious. And hence we start talking about fallacies. So then let's go back here to our basic definition, and it says a fallacy is a kind of error in reasoning. And then it goes on to say there's, this particular document names 231 of the most common fallacies, which in itself tells you that there's way more than that. These are just the most common. And I'd like you to reflect on that fact too. I mean, 231 ways to let's say, go wrong or to error seems like a large amount, but there's actually more than that. In any case, the fact is that there's different ways to define fallacies, and it becomes difficult to sort of classify what exactly is a fallacy and when. But I think there's some points for you to keep in mind that'll help with all of this, and to get a feel for what fallacies are. So keep in mind, a fallacy is a type of error in reasoning. Now let's talk about this for a second. So when we say fallacy, we do not mean, fallacy does not mean false. It does not mean untrue, right? This isn't what we mean by fallacy. Fallacy does not mean false. It does not mean untrue. A fallacy is simply, actually, let me do it this way, and we're just going to sort of define it the way that they defined it here. So that's point number one. We'll define fallacy. So definition, fallacy as an error in, I'm going to say, the reasoning process. So that'll be our sort of first definition here. Let's just highlight this real quick. Okay. And what this points to, rather than just sort of, vaguely saying that it's an error in reasoning, because reasoning can go, there's different types of reasoning, right? And so we're gonna say we're talking about the reasoning process. And this is kind of what I mean by argument, by a structured way of reasoning. In other words, I believe X because of Y, or I believe this because of that. I hold that this proposition is true because I think this proposition is true. That's kind of what we mean by the process. But we can mean other things too. There are things that are called cognitive fallacies, for example. Cognitive fallacies oftentimes have to deal with perception. And there's a process there too. We're not going to talk about that here. Just it's a little too much for a video like this, and maybe for even class. But there are some cognitive fallacies dealing with perception, where we perceive things to be a certain way, even though even though it's not actually that way. You can look at something what's called like the Mobius strip. You can Google that, the Mobius strip, and this involves a type of kind of manipulates the way our brain works into thinking we're seeing something that seems impossible, and so on. And so on. My point here is that there's other processes other than simply like a structured argument. But this is what we are concerned with here in right now and in this class, and so on. So we have sort of a tentative definition. A fallacy is an error in the reasoning process, or just short, is an error in reasoning. What do we mean by that? When we talk about an argument, we talk about, and again, go back to the reading, to the discussions that we've had. An argument is an attempt to establish the truth of some claim through the use of other claims, of other propositions, right? And so, formally, if we look at a deductive argument, deductive arguments are valid, and I'm going to say by, or let's say in virtue of their structure. So what this means then, if we go by example here, and I'm going to do this quick. Again, you can go back to the other videos on argument where I go into more detail here. So, but if you look at a valid argument like modus ponens, that has the form premise 1, if P, then Q, premise 2, P, therefore, conclusion 3, proposition 3, Q. And what this says, the reason it's valid is because whatever you put for P and Q are just symbolic references. It's just it's a symbol that represents a proposition. And it could represent any proposition as long as it's the type of sentence that's either true or false. And what it says is that, right, something to the effect of, if P is true, then Q is true. That's kind of what this sentence says. And this sentence says P is true. And now, if you look at this, imagine that these are actually true. If it's true that if P is true, and it's true if it's true that if P, then Q, if that's true, and P is true, then Q cannot fail to be true. Why? Because that's what this says here. And so the conclusion has to follow from the premises. And this is simply what we mean by a deductive argument. Now notice, in another case, let me add a page here. In another case, let's look at something that seems sort of familiar. How about this case? If P, then Q, and let's put some words to it. Rather, so let's put it over here. If P, then Q, and let's say this will translate into, let's just use this example. If doctors could be trusted, and we'll let that be P, then you wouldn't need to know your own you wouldn't need to know your own medical history, and that is going to be Q. So let's notice here the if then, right? If P, then Q. Now let's just assume that that's true. And then we talk through it. Well, if doctors could be trusted, then you wouldn't need to know your own medical history. Okay, we kind of know what doctors do. We kind of know what our own medical history is a little bit. But what's true about doctors? Really about any human being. Can you trust any human being 100% of the time without error? And the answer is no, and that includes doctors. In fact, you have to know how to, or when, I guess how to as well, when to fire doctors, and at what time. Because sometimes you need to change doctors for various reasons. Sometimes it's because you can't trust them. The same goes for your bank, for your internet service provider, your energy provider, and so on. But that's just kind of the nature of being human. And so, being ignorant of your own medical history is actually kind of dangerous if you simply rely on other people, particularly doctors, to tell you. You need to know something about your own medical history. And so we can say, but it is not the case that Q, if you can trust medical doctors, if doctors could be trusted, then you wouldn't need to know your own medical history. But you can't trust doctors like 100%. Right? Not that you can't ever trust them, but I think you know what I mean. You can't ever trust them like 100%. And so this is not Q. Now, if those are true, then what might this suggest? Therefore, if you can't trust doctors, oh, I'm sorry. I made a little bit of a mistake here. I wasn't paying attention. This happens. I was looking at Q here. Not P. Not the case that P. My apologies. It does happen. I was going to do Q again. Not the case that P. But you can't trust doctors. Therefore, it is the case something and that's not Q. Sorry, that's down there, so that points to there, and then that's not Q. Now, this seems, here's the thing, this seems like a perfectly reasonable argument. It seems kind of like the argument we did before. But in fact, the conclusion does not follow from this. It might actually be true that you need to know about your medical history, and for all practical purposes, it is true. It certainly is true that you can't trust doctors 100% of the time. Obviously, you need to go to a doctor, and I hope you go regularly. It's just that you can't trust them 100%. Sometimes you have to go to other doctors. Sometimes you have to know better than the doctor in certain cases. Right? So it turns out, though, the reason why this actually isn't a valid argument doesn't have anything to do necessarily with what doctors are, what the word doctor means, with knowing medical history, with knowledge. It actually doesn't have anything to do with the words themselves. It has to actually do with the structure of the argument itself. What do I mean? Now, don't worry about this too much. I'm not gonna explain this in a great amount of detail. I'm going to kind of give you the conclusion to this, and if you want, we can talk about it in class, or we can, meet outside of class and I can discuss this for you. But I'm just going to show you the conclusion to a larger argument here. If we put this sentence, if P then Q, into what we call its sentential form, the form of a sentence, rather than simply the form of a standard argument, and not P, therefore, it is not the case that Q. What ends up happening is we have a case where the sentence as a whole, and that's what this gives us. Again, this is a truth table. Don't worry about it. You don't need to know what a truth table is. We're not doing that in this class. I just want to give you the conclusion here. In a sentence that is valid, in an argument that is valid, what you have is, in a case like this, it would all come out true, and there's only four places here. In this case, what you end up having is a case where you have a value for false in, I guess you can't see the cursor, you have a value for false in the operator that gives us the value for the entire sentence. And this is how we know that this argument is actually invalid. The conclusion does not follow from the premise, even though it looks like it does and it sounds like it does. You actually have to run a proof for it to know that it doesn't. Whereas, if we have the argument, if we have the argument, if P, then Q, the modus ponens argument, and P, therefore Q, this actually does come out true in all four cases. And that's how we know the argument is valid. Again, right now, I'm simply asking you to trust me. We can do this in class if you want. All you need to know is that this form of argument, and it is an argument, is actually invalid, even though it sounds like it. And so this is what we call the fallacy of denying, and that's what that is, the antecedent. That's the first part of an if-then statement. And this is an A. Denying the antecedent. And that's what this fallacy is called. The fallacy of denying the antecedent. Again, you don't necessarily have to worry about the name. Of course, if you think it's interesting. This happens all the time. So advice is often given in this form. If you speed, then you'll get a ticket. You didn't speed, therefore you don't get a ticket. That's not necessarily true, right? It's fallacious to think that way. If you go outside with wet hair, then you'll get a cold. You go outside with wet hair and you don't get a cold. It's easy to find counterexamples to why this stuff is false. But this is a good way of thinking about what a fallacy is. A fallacy is simply an error in reasoning. And in this case, we have what's called I guess let me go back here, what is called a formal fallacy. And that's what we were looking at just now. And formal fallacies involves denying the antecedent, affirming the consequent. Sorry, that's funny. Affirming the consequent, and this is where you have the form If P, then Q, and not Q, therefore not P. It looks very similar to denying the antecedent. Anyway, there's several formal fallacies. Don't worry about it. But the fact is that in these cases, the conclusion does not follow from the premises. It looks like it does. It sounds like it does. You have to run a proof that demonstrates, in fact, that it doesn't. And then you can find natural language examples that demonstrate that the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. Then we get into what are known as informal fallacies. And these are kind of the fun ones. This is in large part what the list that you have comprise informal fallacies. And we can go back to this and just go over this sort of really quickly, and pick out some of the examples here, so and talk about them, so you can just sort of be more familiar with them. Here's sort of a taxonomy of fallacies, and there's all sorts of ways to categorize what fallacies are. But notice here, it's not sort of a precise term. You just need to know that what we're looking for when we talk about fallacies is it's just like a red flag. Somebody says something, whether it's you or somebody else, and we're asking that you stop, take a step back, and ask yourself, okay, does this make sense? For example, what's being assumed that the author is or is not telling you? Does the conclusion actually follow? Is there an error here? Is one of the assumptions wrong? Are they presenting an argument? Are they jumping to conclusions? Are they making a generalization that isn't warranted or that needs to be justified? And so on, and so on, and so on. It's just a way to help us be a little more precise in our thinking. But remember, fallacy does not mean false. You can come to some conclusion through fallacious means, and yet the conclusion still be true. Like, you still should believe the conclusion. It's just that if you arrive at that conclusion through a fallacy, you've arrived at the conclusion through a mistake, which means you need better reasoning to justify the thing that you believe in, and so you need to redo that reasoning process. So fallacy doesn't mean false here. It's just an error. And so we need to correct the error. So make sure you read this part here. It's a really interesting aspect of fallacies. And then here's again sort of our taxonomy. There's ad hominems, when you attack the character of a person rather than what they're saying. Politician X says, we need to maintain church and state, but then you say, oh, well, but politician X, doesn't like cats either. So you start attacking who they are rather than the validity of what they're saying. You attack the type of person they are rather than the truth of their conclusion or what they believe in. And who I am is oftentimes irrelevant to whether what I'm saying is true or false. In other words, you may or may not like me, but that doesn't mean that that what I'm proposing is false or that you shouldn't listen to me. Appeal to pity. This is sort of we're all familiar with this, right? Pity is a really strong type of emotion. Oftentimes we donate to charity out of pity. It might be the homeless guy on the street who's begging for money. Out of a sense of pity, you might give to them because you feel bad, right? But you have to ask yourself, is that a good reason to donate or not? Should you donate because you feel bad? And if you donate because you feel pity for someone, that may or may not be a good reason to do it. And so the onus is on you to, as the one giving the money, to sort of think about, well, is this a good reason to donate? Should I actually donate? And do I need to get over that sort of strong feeling? Are there better reasons to donate? Or is pity a bad reason for donating? Or say, like, another charity is just sort of a good example. So, or like the animal commercials where you hear, you see these animals in a really sad state. It's really depressing. It's hard to look at. And then they have that Sarah McLachlan song, uh, City of Angels or Arms of an Angel. You know what I'm talking about. And it really pulls at those heartstrings, as we say. And we might be tempted to donate our time and our money because of that. And you have to ask yourself, is that a good reason to donate? And so on. There's affirming the consequent. We talked about that. And so you can look at these this sort of taxonomy he has here, and so on. But let's just get to some of the actual fallacies themselves, and just sort of, I'm just going to run through these and just give you an idea of how to think about fallacies, and then I'll end by talking about sort of how you should look at fallacies and how to find them, and so on. So an ad hominem is basically an attack of a person. Here is let's actually, I want to do this, the general ad hominem. You make an irrelevant attack on the arguer by referring, this translates into to the person. Homonym is where we get our word homo as in homo sapien, person, right, to the person, directed at the person. And so, like I said, when you criticize who someone is in an effort to undermine the claim that they made, then you've committed an ad hominem. So if I get up, I'm going to a conference later, actually in about an hour here. I'm going to a conference on artificial intelligence and ethics. And if I ask a question, or let's say I make a point to one of the panelists and I say, so-and-so, you said this during your talk, but I think you're mistaken because, blah, blah, blah. And imagine the person responding to me and saying, oh, well, you would say that because you're a philosopher. That's an ad hominem, right? It's an attempt to discredit what I've said because of the type of person I am. And that's irrelevant to whether my claim is true or false. And so here the example is what she says about Johannes Kepler. If you don't know who Kepler is, he's the guy who formulated our first laws of gas, like how gases work. Says about what she says about Johannes Kepler's astronomy for the 1600s must be just so much garbage. Do you realize that she's only 15 years old? 15-year-old has nothing, being 15 has nothing to do with whether or not her claims about Kepler are true or false. And so the impetus is upon the person making the claim to demonstrate that their claims are true, or secondarily upon us to demonstrate that the claims are false. But being 15 has nothing to do with whether or not the claim is false or not. And so on and so on and so on. Let's go back here. How about the ad baculum? This is a famous one, appeal to fear. When you appeal to fear, you say, oh, you shouldn't do that because you might die. So if you remember the cancer advertisement that I showed you for Canada, like you either get a cholesterol screening or you have a final exam where that means your autopsy, right? That's an ad baculum. That's an appeal to fear. Do this or face death. That's an appeal to fear. And we say it's a mistaken reasoning, because although fear is important, and no one's suggesting that you shouldn't ever be fearful, you should. Fear is what's called an evolutionary stable strategy, an ESS. It's an adaptive psychological disposition that helps us survive. We need to feel fear in order to not just avoid dangerous situations, excuse me, but actually to run into situations. So fear actually is a good motivator to do certain things. If you're fearful that your child might die, given a certain situation, that might cause you to actually go try to rescue them or do something you normally wouldn't do, and so on. But in some cases, it's a bad motivator, right? You should get regular screenings, not out of fear of death, but in order to promote good health, for example. After all, nobody avoids death, everybody dies, right? But there are better reasons, rather than fear, to do certain things. Or, for example, you should do your homework and study, partly because, yeah, you don't want to fail, so there's the fear of failure. But there's better reasons to do your work and to study, like increasing your knowledge, increasing your awareness, your intellectual ability, and so on. So fear, is a good thing to have and to experience, but it's not always a good reason to do certain things. Let's do, you're all familiar with the ad populum. This is appeal to popularity, in a sense. Um, when you say, everyone believes that, or everyone's doing it, it must be true, then it might be. The thing might be true, right? So everyone believes 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. And most of you, probably none of you, have seen an actual proof that 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. But why do you believe it? Well, you believe it because everyone else believes it. In a sense, that's true, right? The people around you believe it. The people who taught it to you believe it. And that is part, in fact, why you believe it. But it's not true because people believe it. The fact that 1 plus 1 is true has nothing to do with the fact that most people believe it. It's true because of other reasons. You just happen to believe it because everybody else. You happen to believe it because that's how you were taught. But the truth of the claim depends on something else other than the fact that other people believe it. And so, although the fact that many, let's just say everybody believes some proposition, might be a good indication that you might want to believe the thing, nevertheless, it's going to be up to you or to somebody to actually demonstrate that that thing is worth believing. After all, it's true that everyone could get it wrong. And so, as reasonable people, as people concerned with excellence in reasoning, it's up to us to take that extra step. And that's going to be the difference between excellence in reasoning and non-excellence in reasoning. You can go through this. You don't need to read all of them. If you're a nerd like me, at one point you will have read all of these. But here's bifurcation I talked about before. This is otherwise known as a false dilemma. It's when you impose either this or this, and you eliminate any other objection, any other possibility that something could be, right? You either go to school or work at McDonald's for the rest of your life. And although as a rhetorical device, as a way of demonstrating how important school might actually be, there's other options. It's simply not true that if you don't go to school, you're going to work at McDonald's the rest of your life. 2, working at McDonald's the rest of your life might be desirable. It's not for me, but for some people it is. For some people, it's a desirable place to be in. And fine, so be it. So when you force Now, sometimes in life there are only two options, or it could be three options or four options, right? It's when you limit the number of options when in fact there are more. But sometimes in life there are only two options. And in such cases, fine. You would have to demonstrate that there are only two options, and so you're not committing a fallacy. But generally speaking, when you say it's either this, like what is the famous thing parents do, either my way or the highway, right? That's bad reasoning, generally speaking. Generally speaking. Um, yeah, and so like I think this is a nice example. Will you contribute $20 to our environmental fund, or are you on the side of environmental destruction? Just because I don't donate my money, well, let's say I don't donate any time to environmental funds, does not mean I'm on the side of destruction. There's other options there. All right, just a couple more here, and then I want to show you something, and then we can conclude. False analogy is a good one I talked about in class. False dichotomy, false dilemma. It's kind of the same thing here. You'll find out when you look at these and study these, you'll see that a lot of them overlap. Some of them seem to be identical. Some of them just overlap. Some of them only share qualities. Faulty generalization, faulty motives, group thinking. Group thinking is much like the appeal to popularity. Um, this is circular reasoning. That's a good one. Begging the question is what that is. Jumping to conclusion. We do this one a lot. This is a good one. Jumping to conclusions. Um, how does it work? It's not always a mistake to make a quick decision. It's not. Sometimes you got to make quick decisions, but sometimes you're going to be wrong. Sometimes you'll be right. But when we draw a conclusion without taking the trouble to acquire enough relevant evidence, we can commit this fallacy. So, for example, this happens all the time. You go to a restaurant, and let's say you eat something. Let's say it's a new restaurant, or you eat something different at a restaurant you go to where you eat the same thing. And let's say a few hours later you feel a tummy ache or something, right? Or maybe the next day you get sick or something. We often want to say, oh, it was that restaurant. And we say it definitively and sincerely. There's a chance you're jumping to conclusions here. It might not have been that. In fact, if you go to the doctor for suspected food poisoning, they're going to ask you what you ate within the last 48 hours. Because it can take a couple of days for some of these bacteria and viruses to actually gestate. It's not always, especially like if you get sick within hours. Now, if it's something like botulism, then yeah, you're going to get sick immediately, right? A little bit of botulism can kill you within minutes. That's true. In which case, that's going to be pretty obvious. But if you're just sort of feeling sick a few hours after you ate, it's probably not the food you just ate. It could be. But because of how long it takes bacteria to gestate, and food poisoning is usually bacteria, unless it's something like botulism, then it's probably what you had 24 hours in the past to 48 hours in the past. And so we jump to the conclusion that it's that restaurant, therefore I'm not going to go there again, or I'm going to sue them, or something like that. That's what jumping to conclusions means. Take a look at the logical fallacies. This is important. Yeah, so you can look at these. So just look at red herring is a good one. We do this all the time. Red herring fallacy is when it's an argument of distraction. Um, uh, Usually we use it in a defensive way where somebody says, oh well, Senator, you said this, what did you mean by it? And then as the senator, I'll say, well, what I was referring to. So if you remember, back 10 years ago, and then I start going on this other sort of subject, I'm distracting you from what the original question is. Then I've committed the red herring fallacy. I'm throwing you off the off the trail. I'm throwing you off the track in an attempt to either distract you or hopefully give myself enough time to think of a way to get out of it and so on. We do this stuff all the time. Okay, really quick, I want to switch to, I want to just show you something about, this just came up to me yesterday. This was posted yesterday. So there's this in Tennessee recently. Let me make this bigger for you. Tennessee proposed Senate Bill 1, which prohibits all medical treatments intended to allow a minor to identify with or live as a purported identity inconsistent with the minor's sex. Now, I'm not going to take a side here. I just want to demonstrate something to you. So this is a Senate bill in Tennessee. I believe it passed, if I'm not mistaken. And look at the title here. Come on. 21 Yale philosophers file an amicus brief on case about medical care for transgender minors. So this isn't about what you think about this subject. It's not about what I think about it. I just want to point something to you. Particularly thinking about some of your assignments of identifying examples in the real world of fallacies. What these philosophers did is they went through this entire brief, and you have access to it here. What they did is went through this brief and identified the arguments and showed, and I want to show this to you here, and showed, yeah, here it is, that in one case, one of their arguments is circular, which is a type of fallacy that's begging the question, or circular reasoning. They show that another argument they make is circular, and so is a fallacy. So two of their arguments are actual logical fallacies. They're errors in reasoning that involve the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. And then they go on to show not a circular reasoning, but that one of their judgments depends on a set stereotype that they're trying to actually deny. And so this would be a contradiction. They don't say that here, but that's what they're getting at. My point here is simply that fallacies are important here. And here happens to be a case that just showed up on a feed. And I'm not endorsing or condemning anything here. But here's a case where in the real world, understanding some of this stuff could be very helpful to you. And how understanding how some of this stuff works can actually better inform you and how you approach the world and how you understand the world, and can help you make better decisions. And so the trick with fallacies, and I'll end with this, is to, well, let me put it this way. One of the freshman mistakes that people make, people who become acquainted with this stuff for the first time, is to see fallacies everywhere. And on the one hand, yes, when you start studying this stuff, you're going to realize how many mistakes you make, how many mistakes your neighbor makes, your parents, your friends, your priests, your pastors, your professionals, your business professionals, right? Like your professors even. And to call everybody out or see fallacies everywhere, like Toy Story, right? Fallacies everywhere. The trick is to learn when to call out a fallacy and when to know that something is fallacious, and then to do something about it. We make mistakes all the time, and nobody is asking for perfection. That's impossible. But there are times when it matters. Sometimes it really matters to be careful about how we think about things. And so I, and classes like this, and professors like me, ask you that, like in this bill. Sorry, wrong screen here. In this bill, it's kind of important to know if the reasoning is good or not. And so if it's bad reasoning and you're on the side that wants to have these bans, then it's up to you to redo the reasoning so that at the very least it's valid, right? If you care about the sort of reasoning process. So just a little point here to give you a better, if brief, understanding of what fallacies are, why they're important, and so on and so forth. So till then, I will see you next time. Bye.